You know, there's this really romantic idea of the ship's master that we've had for
Oh,
centuries.
master and a god.
Yeah, exactly. The idea that once your ship leaves port and hits the high seas, your judgment as captain is absolute. If you say the sea was too rough, well, it was too rough.
Right. If you say a decision was necessary for safety, it was necessary. That has been the legal and the cultural bedrock of maritime operations for a very long time. The autonomy of command.
Right. But looking at this massive stack of documents you brought to the table today,
It is a large stack, yes.
it's intimidating. But these amendments coming out of the International Maritime Organization, I mean, I get the feeling that era is quietly being dismantled. We're looking at a convergence of regulations all hitting around January 1st, 2026, and they seem to send a very different message.
They really do. If you look closely at the text we're covering today, the updates to STCW, SOLAS, and MARPOL, the message isn't actually about taking away command. It's about validation.
About
Yes. The IMO is effectively saying, we trust you to sail the ship, but we no longer trust your unverified word on how you sailed it.
So the hook for our listeners here isn't that ships are going to sail differently in 2026. It's that they have to prove they sailed correctly.
Precisely. We are witnessing a structural shift from operational practice where just doing the right thing was enough to demonstrable compliance.
Demonstrable compliance.
Right. Every decision, every incident, and even the social culture on board now demands objective, traceable evidence.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We aren't just going to rattle off a list of resolutions and regulation numbers because, frankly, that is a cure for insomnia. We want to unpack why this is happening and what it actually looks like for you, whether you're a master, a chief engineer, or a technical manager ashore when that deadline hits.
And it is a hard deadline. January 1st, 2026. That is the pivot point where discretion gets replaced by data.
Let's start with the most personal aspect of this shift, the human element. Because we usually talk about steel and fuel, but the amendments to the STCW convention, the standards of training, certification, watchkeeping, they are arguably the most radical.
I would agree with that. We are looking at resolution MSC.560108.
Now, usually when I see an STCW update, I'm expecting it to be about, I don't know, ECDIS training or high voltage systems, but this is amending the basic safety training table. Specifically, Table AVI14.
Correct. And this is where the industry is finally catching up with reality. For decades, if you had a problem with harassment, bullying, or even sexual assault on board a vessel, it was categorized as a conduct issue.
Right, it was an HR problem. If a chief mate was a bully, maybe they got a warning letter from the company.
Or maybe a transfer.
Right, or in a worst-case scenario, they got fired. But their license, their actual ticket to sail, that remained completely untouched.
Exactly. You could be a terrible human being, genuinely detrimental to the crew's mental health, but still be considered competent by the IMO. Resolution MSC.560 changes that definition entirely.
How so?
By embedding the prevention of harassment and bullying directly into the STCW code, they are making it a standard of competence.
Wow, that is a massive psychological shift. So if you don't understand how to prevent violence or harassment, you are now, by definition, professionally incompetent.
Yes, it places psychological safety on the exact same tier as fire safety. And there is a very pragmatic reason for this.
Which is?
Well, we've seen enough accident reports to know that a toxic bridge culture leads to metal bending. If a junior officer is terrified of being bullied by the master, they won't speak up when they see a navigational hazard. Psychological safety is a literal barrier to accidents.
So practically speaking, for the seafarers listening to this right now, does this mean everyone has to run ashore and redo their basic safety training before 2026? Because I can hear the collective groan of logistics managers from here.
That is the big fear, isn't it? But this is the don't panic section of our deep dive. While the requirement is new, the implementation is designed to be transitional.
Okay, transitional. Walk us through that.
Most major administrations, we've seen circulars from India's DGS, guidance from the UK MCA, the Norwegian Maritime Authority. They're taking a very pragmatic approach. If you are an existing seafarer with a valid personal safety and social responsibility certificate, your PSSR, you generally do not need to take a standalone course immediately.
Oh, that's a relief. So the new material just gets folded in later.
Exactly. The new requirements, the training on appropriate response mechanisms, recognizing bullying, understanding social responsibility, all of that will be incorporated into your next scheduled refresher training cycle.
Okay, so you don't need to cancel your next contract. But the writing is clearly on the wall. Behavior is no longer just company culture. It's a license requirement.
It creates a legal basis for removing toxic individuals from the industry. That's the key takeaway here. It's no longer just, well, he's a tough captain. It's he is lacking basic safety competence.
Let's move from the crew mess up to the cargo deck. This next topic feels like a direct response to those viral photos we see every winter. You know the ones? Massive container ships listing heavily, boxes tumbling into the ocean like dominoes?
Lost containers. It's a significant issue, both environmentally and for navigational safety.
In the past, reporting these incidents seemed a bit flexible. I mean, if you lost 3 empty boxes in the middle of the Pacific, did you really have to scream about it?
Historically, yes, there was a lot of discretion. A master might assess the situation and think, well, they aren't dangerous goods. We're 1,000 miles from land. I'll just report it to the office and we'll deal with the insurance later.
Just a commercial loss.
Right. It was treated primarily as a commercial loss. But under the new SOLAS Chapter V amendments, adopted by Resolution MSC.550108, that discretion is basically evaporated.
Completely gone.
Completely. The new regulation mandates reporting without delay. And it's very specific about who you have to tell.
So it's not just the company anymore.
No. You must report to nearby ships because a floating container is a collision hazard. You must report to the coastal state. And you must report to the flag state. It treats a lost container with the same urgency as a derelict vessel or an iceberg.
There's a detail in these amendments that I found really interesting regarding the shoreside responsibility.
Yes, this is crucial for any designated persons ashore listening. The regulation explicitly states that if the ship itself cannot report, maybe the antenna is damaged or the crew is overwhelmed fighting for survival, the obligation to report legally shifts to the company.
So the office can't play dumb.
No, they absolutely cannot. If the ship goes silent and, containers are in the water, the company is legally on the hook to make that broadcast. It formalizes the accountability chain. It's no longer a judgment call. It's a statutory obligation.
This theme of removing judgment calls and replacing them with hard rules leads us perfectly into the next segment. This is probably the most tech-heavy update in the 2026 stack. We're talking about stability and the black box of rolling.
Electronic inclinometers. Resolution MSC.532107.
Before we get into the gadget itself, let's paint the picture of the old way for a second. A ship hits a storm. It rolls 25 degrees. It feels terrifying. How does that actually get recorded today?
Subjectively, the officer of the watch grips the handrail, looks at a bubble level, which is literally just liquid in a curved tube, and makes a guess. They write in the logbook, vessel rolling heavily, approx 25 degrees.
Approx.
Approx is the enemy of investigation. In a court of law, or during a casualty inquiry, that logbook entry is just one person's memory. And memory is incredibly unreliable under stress.
Right. Did the heavy roll happen before the cargo shifted or after?
Exactly. Was it a sudden lurch or a resonant buildup? You don't know from a logbook.
So enter the electronic inclinometer. Now, just to be clear for the listeners, this doesn't apply to everyone, right? The tanker fleet gets a pass.
For this specific amendment, yes. The requirement applies to new container ships and bulk carriers of 3,000 gross tons and above constructed on or after January 1st, 2026.
Okay, so if you're building a new Capesize or a new Neo-Panamax, this is mandatory. What does this device actually do that a bubble level doesn't?
It provides objective, traceable data. It records the actual roll motion, the timestamp, the heel angle, and the roll period. It creates a digital footprint of the ship's stability profile.
So if a captain claims, hey, we were hit by a rogue wave, it came out of nowhere, but the data stream shows a progressive stability failure over 4 hours where the roll period was getting shorter and shorter.
The data tells the real story.
Yeah.
It aligns the ship's internal reality with the external investigation. It completely removes the bridge folklore from the equation.
It really is the show your work era. You can't just say the ship was stable. You have to have the data file to prove it.
And that protects the crew, too, in a way. If they actually were handling the ship correctly and the cargo shifted due to poor lashing from the stevedores, the inclinometer data will prove that the ship's motion was within limits until the structural failure occurred. It cuts both ways.
Now, sticking with SOLAS, there are a couple of other changes that seem to be tightening the screws on things that used to be, let's say, loosely regulated. Lifting appliances, cranes, winches, loose gear.
This is Resolution MSC.532107. Again, introducing SOLAS Regulation 2-1313.
I mean, ships have always tested their cranes. You have to. Class societies demand it. Cargo operations completely depend on it. Why make it a SOLAS requirement?
It's about statutory weight. Before, if a port state control officer came aboard and found your crane greasing records were messy or a load test was overdue, it was often treated as a class matter or a minor deficiency.
A slap on the wrist. Fix it before you leave.
Exactly. But by moving this into SOLAS, it becomes a breach of the Safety of Life at Sea Convention. It elevates a rusty winch brake to the same level of legal seriousness as a hole in a lifeboat.
So it reduces the interpretational variation between different ports.
It does. It means you can be detained specifically for lifting appliance failure under international law, not just local or class rules. It forces technical managers to ensure their planned maintenance systems for cranes are ironclad.
And speaking of ironclad systems, let's look at fire safety, specifically on ro-ro ships. Roll on, roll off. We've seen some horrific fires lately involving car carriers. Felicity Ace comes to mind immediately.
Vehicle deck fires are notoriously difficult. You have a massive open space, thousands of vehicles, plenty of fuel, and nowadays, potentially lithium-ion batteries.
And the problem has always been locating the fire, right?
Speed of detection is everything. In the past, a smoke detector might just tell the bridge, fire in Zone C. Well, Zone C could be the size of a football field, packed with cars and quickly filling with toxic black smoke.
So you send a crew member down with a breathing apparatus to try and find it.
Which takes time, precious minutes. And in those minutes, the fire jumps from 1 car to 10.
So how do the 2026 amendments actually fix this?
Through enhanced detection and monitoring. Resolutions MSC.550108 and MSC.555-108 require fixed fire detection systems with individually identifiable detectors.
So instead of Zone C, the panel says Detector 42, Deck 5, Frame 100.
Pinpoint accuracy. You know exactly where the heat is. And they are pairing that with mandatory continuous video monitoring, CCTV, for vehicle and ro-ro spaces.
That feels huge for situational awareness. The officer of the watch doesn't have to wait for a radio report from the fire team. They can just look at the screen.
They can confirm the fire, see the volume of smoke, and initiate the deluge system or CO2 much faster. It removes the hesitation. Again, notice the pattern here. We aren't relying on a human to run down a check. We're relying on sensors and cameras to give objective truth to the bridge immediately.
It creates eyes in the dark.
Exactly.
Let's move to the final piece of the puzzle today, the environment. MARPOL. Traceability seems to be the buzzword here, too.
It is. We are seeing a documentation war on pollution.
Let's talk about Flashpoint. This is technically a SOLAS safety issue, but it plays out in the environmental paperwork.
Fuel oil flashpoint is critical. SOLAS says fuel cannot have a flashpoint below 60 degrees Celsius. If it does, it's an explosion hazard in the purifiers and fuel lines.
But how does the chief engineer actually know? The barge comes alongside, pumps the fuel. You basically have to trust the supplier.
Trust but verify was the old way. The new amendments to SOLAS Chapter 2 require the bunker delivery note, the BDN, to explicitly declare the flashpoint.
So the supplier has to go on record.
They must state the actual measured value or explicitly certify that the fuel has been measured at or above 70 degrees. They cannot just leave that column blank or put in a generic code anymore.
Why is it such a big deal for the crew?
It gives the chief engineer a paper shield. If that fuel turns out to be off-spec or dangerous later, the ship have a legal document from the supplier guaranteeing its safety. It forces the supply chain to take ownership of quality control before the fuel ever crosses the rail.
It empowers the chief to say no. If the BDN isn't right, the hose doesn't connect.
Exactly. And speaking of strict paperwork, we have to mention the garbage record book. This is under MARPOL Annex V. The threshold for keeping this book has dropped significantly, hasn't it? It used to be mandatory for ships of 400 gross tons and above. Now, the limit is 100 gross tons.
100 GT is tiny. That's a harbor tug, a large workboat, a super yacht.
It brings a massive fleet of coastal traders and offshore support vessels into the formal audit regime.
So no more, hey, we're too small to keep a log.
No more tossing trash bags on the dock without a receipt. Every discharge, every incineration, every transfer to a port facility must be logged. It closes the small ship loophole. The IMO is basically saying, we don't care how small you are. If you float, you account for your waste.
And briefly, just to round out the environmental section, firefighting foam.
Yes, the ban on PFOS, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. It's a forever chemical, highly toxic.
This isn't a documentation change, this is a hardware change.
It is a strict prohibition. If you have old foam stocks containing PFOS, they need to be removed and disposed of properly. It's a hard stop on that chemical.
We have covered a massive amount of ground here today. From the psychology of bullying and STCW to the physics of roll angles and SOLAS to the chemistry of fuel flashpoints.
It is a lot to digest for anyone in the industry.
But if you stand back and look at the whole picture of 2026, what do you see? Because to me, it feels like the job itself is changing.
Well, the job of sailing remains the same. The sea is still wet, the wind still blows, and physics hasn't changed. But the job of compliance has fundamentally shifted.
Walk us through that pattern one last time.
Look at the common denominator across all these amendments. Welfare. It's now a certified competence, not just a policy. Reporting lost containers. It's a mandatory obligation, not a judgment call. Stability. It's a digital recording, not a logbook entry. Environment. It's about traceable paperwork like the BDN.
It's the death of operational discretion.
It is the rise of demonstrable compliance. The industry is moving to a model where if you cannot prove you did it right with objective data, then you are assumed to be wrong.
That is a sobering thought for the old salt captains who rely on gut instinct.
It is. But for the industry as a whole, it levels the playing field. It exposes the operators who are cutting corners. You can't fake an inclinometer trace. You can't fake a flashpoint declaration, at least not without massive legal risk.
So for the technical managers and masters listening, 2026 isn't asking you to reinvent the wheel. It's asking you to make sure the wheel is instrumented, recorded, and certified.
Get your documentation in order, check your training matrices, verify your new build specs. The audit is coming.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that struck me while we were diving into these sources. We are building ships that see, feel, and record absolutely everything.
The digital ship, yes.
Right now, these tools, the inclinometer, the CCTV, the sensors, they are there to support the captain, to give them better information to make decisions. But if compliance is now based entirely on objective recorded data, how long until human judgment in the logbook becomes totally secondary to the ship's digital footprint?
That is the big question. If the digital inclinometer says the ship is rolling dangerously, and the human captain says, it's fine, I've seen worse, who does the shore office believe? Who does the judge believe?
I think we all know the answer to that. The machine usually wins in court.
And that might be the biggest shift of all. The transfer of authority from the person on the bridge to the server in the cloud.
On that slightly ominous but definitely fascinating note, we are going to wrap up this deep dive into the 2026 amendments.
Stay ahead of the regulations and stay safe out there.
Thanks for listening. We will see you on the next deep dive.